location. But also, federal capitals are unique in that in that they have to play a national role. They also have to play a local role. Capitals are also where people live and work. So this issue, this is constantly in tension: the national role versus the local role. And all of these play out somehow in the cases that we've chosen. Every capital has a unique story in terms of location. I mean, we've got an illustrative list here. I mean, in South Africa, after transition to majority rule, had a very difficult time finding a single place to put its capital. But in reflecting the divided nature of the country, for pragmatic reasons, they continued to run the government and bureaucracy out of Pretoria, now called Tshwane, but decided that to counterbalance a concentration of power in Pretoria by locating Parliament in Cape Town, several hundred miles away. Abuja in Nigeria was a purpose-built capital from the late 1980s onwards, when construction started, to locate the capital in a neutral zone, if you will, between the historic north and the historic south, southern regions. Berlin, symbol of reunification. There was a long and hard debate about whether to move the capital from Bonn to Berlin after reunification, and the decision was made because this was symbolic of the reconstruction of Germany, and also because Berlin again sat on the fault line between East and West Germany. I mean, that was talking about a $500 million deficit or debt that DC had taken on. Well, Berlin, in deciding to move the federal government to Berlin, the city of Berlin, the city and state of Berlin, was saddled with a debt of $60 billion, which they've had a very difficult time paying off, because Berlin, in addition to capital city functions, had to absorb a lot of the costs associated with bringing East Berlin in infrastructurally and sort of personnel-wise up. Canberra, again, the choice was, well, it's not Melbourne, Adelaide, or Sydney. And in setting up Canberra, the big cities mandated that a capital must be set up in the middle of the country so that it had no access to ports, because all cities in Australia are on the coast, and they felt that somehow their importance would be eclipsed if a national capital was set up on the coast. So you see these tensions are playing out in the way capital cities are organized. Now, there's been some discussion about, I think Nat talked about it, Steve talked about it, the advantages of being a capital city. Clearly there are costs, but there are also very, very important advantages to being a capital city. About a year and a half ago, as the recession was starting out, the Times magazine did an article on growing urban regions. And in the 10 cities they surveyed in terms of that were booming, in terms of culture, in terms of the economy, in terms of employment, 9 out of 10 cities happen to be capital cities. I don't know what the situation is like in DC in terms of property prices, but certainly in Ottawa, as we were discussing earlier, even though in the rest of Canada prices have stabilized, home prices in Ottawa continue to rise. Capitals are home to high quality employment, stable economies because they're relatively recession free because of public sector jobs. So there are clearly lots of advantages to being a capital. So much so that in some cases the costs may actually outweigh the advantages outweigh the costs of being a capital. And I'll give you an example of this. In many parts of the world where you had a purpose-built capital, or a capital had to be chosen from where there was none, cities who didn't end up being the capital had to be compensated. The story I like to tell always is about Switzerland. Switzerland for many years didn't actually have a capital city. The Swiss parliament moved from canton to canton, and at some point they found this was rather expensive and not a very effective way to run a government. So 3 cities were shortlisted to be capitals: Basel, Zurich, and Bern. And the reason that neither Zurich nor Basel made it in the end. Basel because it was too Catholic, Zurich because it was too commercial. And so this chose this obscure town, this obscure canton called Bern, to set up the home of the national capital. But both Basel and Zurich were compensated. Zurich with the Institute of Technology, and Basel with, I believe, sort of law courts and things like that. So there is, everyone wants to be a capital, even though there may be costs associated with it. I've talked a little bit about the benefits and costs, benefits outweighing costs. What I'll do is, at this point, I'll turn the presentation over to Enid, who can then talk about governing structures and finance. Thank you very much.
Enid Slack is the director of the Institute of Municipal Finance and Governance and an adjunct professor at the Monk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto. She specializes in municipal and intergovernmental finance and is a member of the steering committee of the Ontario Municipal Knowledge Network and the advisory board of the International Property Tax Institute. Please welcome, and we're very glad you're here, Enid Slack.
Thank you very much, Steve, and thank you everyone for coming out this morning. This is the book we're talking about on capital cities. And as Rupak said, when we started out with this book, we sort of wondered what we were doing. But now we think it's quite a good read. I mean, it's actually interesting to find out what different cities around the world are doing. But I have to say, Steve, when you were giving your introductory remarks, they were so eloquent, I thought, why didn't we ask you to write the introduction to the book? Because you added a lot of things that we maybe left out. So as Rupak said, I'm going to talk about a little bit about the governing structure and the finance. And there are basically three models of governing structure that are used in capital cities and federal countries. The federal district model, which is where a city is carved out of two states or two cantons or two provinces to form a federal district, either through a constitutional ruling or just the national government does this. There are city-states, which are governments that have city powers, both in terms of their responsibilities and their taxing powers, as well as state powers. And then there are cities within a province that are just like any other city in the country. And these are our cities in the book and how they're divided up. Now, as Rupak mentioned, we only have 11 cities in the book. There are 26 federal countries, so we don't have them all. And it was interesting, we did have a review of our book done in a journal in Australia. And one of the criticisms was that we didn't really know what federal countries were. Like, why didn't we have Spain in there? And why didn't we have this one? He didn't read that line that said availability of authors was a really important part of what we did. So we weren't trying to do all federal countries, but we do have 11. But I think this breakdown among the governing structures reflects really what capital cities are like. So a lot of them are federal districts, like Washington. There are very few city-states, and there are few that are cities within a province or state. So federal districts are an interesting model. That's where the national seat of government is not under the jurisdiction of any one state or province. And you could see why a national government would want to do that. They would want to have complete control over their capital cities and not be fighting with a state government about what's happening. But having said that, the extent of federal control in the cities that we looked at was quite different. In Abuja, it was tightly controlled. It's not an elected mayor. The head of state, the head of Abuja is appointed by the federal government. The federal government can overrule just about anything that Abuja wants to do. At the other end of the spectrum, you have Canberra, which is largely an autonomous city-state, although the federal government does have some role in planning. And I know I had some heated discussions with our author of that chapter, Graham Sansom from Australia. He didn't want me to put Canberra under a federal district. He wanted it under city-state. So it's sort of at the end of federal districts that really goes into city-states. One of the issues around federal districts is the issue of local democratic and accountability deficit. So there's a feeling that Rupak talked at the beginning about the balance between the national interest and local interest. The interest of being a capital city for the whole country, but people living their daily lives and wanting services delivered by their local government. And the federal district model moves more towards that national perspective and away from the local perspective. And there's often limited fiscal autonomy for federal districts. One of the good things, though, is there's direct access to federal funds. So if you're a city in a province, you're fighting like everybody else for money. In a federal district model, there's that direct route to the federal funds. City-states combine local and state functions, as we mentioned, but unlike a federal district, there are no restrictions on those state functions. So the city, for example, like Berlin has city functions and state functions. So there's less federal influence over the capital city under this model than any of the other models, because this is like any other state government. They tend to be fairly small, so there's limited fiscal capacity and limited access to that federal money. As I said before, they're fighting with other states or provinces to get federal money. The third model of cities in a province or state, here, and this is the Ottawa example. Ottawa is a city just like any other city in the province of Ontario. It gets most of its funding from the provincial government. The federal government gives very little money to cities in Canada because constitutionally cities are creatures of the provinces. That doesn't mean the federal government has no role or no influence on capital cities under this model. In the Ottawa example, they've set up a national capital commission that does a lot of planning and tourism functions. And of course, the federal government can spend money anywhere it likes, and it can spend money in cities and have some control that way. And of course, the third way is that the federal government owns land in the capital city. And in Ottawa, for example, the whole green belt around the city of Ottawa is federal land, and that's not developed. And of course, in that way, the federal government has a fair bit of control over land use. There's limited institutional interaction with the federal government, as I mentioned, both in the Swiss case and in the Canadian case. The municipalities are creatures of the province or the canton. There are informal mechanisms for federal, state, municipal coordination, but they're fairly informal. Of course, here on the spectrum of national control versus local autonomy, there's a lot more local autonomy. But then the cities turn around and complain that they're not getting any federal recognition or support. So there's pros and cons to each of these models. Let's turn now to the financing of capital cities. Capital cities provide services like any other cities. They provide police and fire protection, water and sewer, roads and transit, garbage collection and disposal, recreation, culture, parks, land use planning, the whole range of city functions. They collect taxes, taxes on property, income, sales. They collect user fees, for example, for transit, recreation. They receive transfers from sometimes the federal, but most often provincial or state governments, investment income, and other revenues. So in this way, capital cities are like other cities, with some exceptions. As Rupak mentioned in his comments, in Delhi, the federal district provides local services, but the federal government is responsible for policing and land use in the federal district. So two very major local functions are done by the federal government. In Canberra, policing is provided by the federal police force. We've also heard a little bit this morning already about the special case of the property tax. Now, as you look around the world, the property tax is very important for local governments in some countries, but not all countries. So it's important in Australia, Canada, South Africa, and the US.